I kind of subscribe by that principle of I'd rather drive a slow car fast than a fast car slow. Maybe that's just because I can only afford slow cars. Welcome back to another episode of Cody Builds. On today's episode, we're going to be finishing the rebuild of our Ford 9-inch rear end. We've got to finish cleaning up the housing, prime and paint the housing, and then start the assembly process. I did go ahead and order replacement axles from Speedway Motors. I have to take a moment and say Speedway is freaking awesome. I don't have a sponsorship through them. They don't know me from anyone else. I ordered parts on Wednesday night. They showed up at my door on Friday. So there was even a situation where they had just restocked the lug nuts the wheel studs that I need. I got 2 phone calls and an email telling me that, hey, we just got these back in stock. We think they'll make it out for your order to get them to you on Friday, but we're not sure. And I wasn't really that concerned about it. I did want to get the parts before Saturday, but if I didn't have the wheel studs, it wasn't the end of the world. But the customer service was fantastic. I've ordered from Summit. They're good as well, but I find myself leaning more and more towards Speedway. So I want to give their customer service a huge shout out, because without them, we wouldn't have the axles for today, and we'd be stuck another week before we could get this rear end back together. So they are cut to fit axles, so you're going to see that today. I'll show you how to measure and how to cut those down and get them installed in the rear end. So first things first, we're going to do the last little bit of cleaning. I already went ahead with my Dremel and a little wire wheel and got a little hard to reach places. Kind of cleaned up the gasket face and a few other things. What I'm going to do is I don't have a fine thread tap for the third member studs, but I did keep one of the old nuts. I'm going to show you how I go through and clean up the threads on those old studs. I'm just going to soak them down in WD-40, run that nut up and down a couple times on each stud until the threads are clean. That's going to allow us to get the proper torque spec when we go to torque down the third member. So let's get the camera up and we'll get set up. We'll get that going first. Then we'll wipe down the rear housing. We'll prime it. We'll let that set up a little bit, and then we'll get it painted. Okay, so I've just got one of the old nuts here, and it's since stuck in my socket. So let's get that pulled out real quick. I just saved, there was only 2 nuts on this thing, but I saved the ones that I had. And what we're going to do is we're just going to soak this thing down in WD-40. And I'm going to soak all the studs as well here real quick. And we're going to have to come in and clean all this up before we paint as well. So that's okay. I want to make sure these studs are all cleaned up. The right way to do this would be with a tap, but I don't have the right fine thread tap for these. So we're going to make do with what we have. And we're just going to use one of these old nuts. So all I'm going to do for each of these, I'm just going to get this started. I'm going to run it up and down a couple times with the impact here. You can actually hear when the threads get cleaned up. It's impacting the first time down. Next time down, nice and clean. So I'll go ahead and do that for all these studs. Okay, it's that simple. Now, the reason I do that is if you have all that crud and crap in those threads when you're trying to torque down the third member, this goes for anything that you're working on. If you don't have clean threads, your torque spec is gonna be off, because you're gonna have some amount of torque that goes into just turning the nut on the threads rather than actually clamping force. So it's always important to have clean hardware when you're doing anything that's got a torque spec. So if you're working with something that's been painted over, is rusty, crusty, it's got a bunch of grease on it, it's best to clean those threads up before you torque everything down. So, okay, I've got these all cleaned up. The next step here, I'm going to grab a couple rags and I'm going to clean out the inside of this thing. I'm going to get all the debris and crap from wire wheeling out of this thing. And then, you know, I still got quite a bit of silicone on the face of this, so I'll have to grab a razor blade. I'm going to scrape all this up. I'm going to clean all the debris and crap out of the inside of the housing, and then we're going to wipe this thing down with mineral spirits. All right, I used these Rolox, 3M Rolox to clean up the face, the gasket face of the rear housing. One note: these are abrasive. If you do have a set of these lying around, and you're thinking, oh, you know, that looks like it works really good for taking off gasket material. Don't use them on any aluminum engine gasket parts, aluminum engine parts. They will actually remove material, and they can cause low spots, and they can ruin a set of heads if you're not careful, if you're too aggressive with them. So, but this is a steel housing, and you know, we don't need to be super precise here. We just need to get a good clean surface for sealing. I got about as much stuff off of this as I could. I used some brake lean, some those Rolox, and just a Scotch-Brite pad, like a 800 grit scuffing pad. And then I went ahead and cleaned the inside out. I sprayed it with brake lean and got all of the gasket remnants and all that stuff out. I'm going to change the order of operations here a little bit. I was going to prime and paint this first, but I don't really want to tape off all this stuff, and the third member is not painted either. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to install the third member, and then once that's installed, we will wipe this whole thing down, get it clean, get all the dirt off of it, all the grease, and then we'll prime and paint the third member and the housing all in one shot. Before I start priming and painting, I'm actually going to measure for my axle lengths, so that while this is drying, I can be cutting down and doing some of the work on those axles that needs to be done before those go back in the housing. So yeah, I'll get this bench cleaned up a little bit. We'll get the third member over here. We'll go ahead and get that installed, and then we will prime and paint this thing. Alright, I had a little camera issue, so I missed part of the steps here, but I got the housing all cleaned up, and I put a small bead of silicone around underneath this gasket. I laid it between the studs and then around the inside, and now I'm about halfway around on top of the gasket, and I'm doing the same thing. The only other thing I wanted to note was that this gasket is directional. These studs are not evenly spaced all the way around. They're offset to one side. So before you try and lay that into your silicone, just make sure you have the gasket oriented in the proper direction. You shouldn't have to force it on. It should slide right over the top of the studs. So I'm going to continue laying this silicone around, and then we will drop the third member in. Now, silicone's probably not really required in this situation, but I'm just kind of wanting to, it's almost like a belt and suspenders kind of thing here. I just want to make sure that this gets good and sealed and I don't have any leaks. So, alright, I've got silicone on the bottom layer, put the gasket on, silicone on the top, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the third member on in place here. So, let's do that. This thing is heavy. Oof. Trick will be to drop this in without smashing my fingers. Okay, I got it set up on the studs here. I'm just gonna rotate it into place. Okay, I do have it in the right direction here. What's going on? I don't have it the right direction. I forgot these, yeah, so that's my fault. I've got this upside down. The leaf springs were on top of the rear end. Don't know why I was operating under the assumption that they're on the bottom. So I've actually got this upside down, but I'll lift this, flip it around. This is a perfect example. If you had your gasket on upside down, you can see the holes don't line up. I can't get this thing to fall into place. So it is directional. It's only going to go on one way. I'll get this spun around the right direction. We'll get it on, and then we'll get it tightened down. Just going just tight with these. I'm going to go in a star pattern. Not doing anything too nuts here. Okay, I can't even get a socket. So you can see I can't really get a socket on these bottom two. So the bottom ones will have to be done with the arm torque wrench, the wrist torque, and we'll get it close so it'll be fine. Okay, let me grab the torque wrench next. Alright, I've seen differing numbers on torque spec for the third member to the case, to the housing. I've seen 35, I've seen 40. We're going to go with 40 foot-pounds. So I've got my torque wrench set to 40 foot-pounds. What we're going to do is first go around here, we're going to torque everything down to 20 foot-pounds, and then we're going to come back and snug everything down to 40. So we're going to do it in two steps here. Okay. Okay, so you can see here, I've got the old axle on the left, new axle on the right. A couple things to note. One is the obvious difference in length, right? The second is you see the spline length there, and you can actually see where the spline, the discoloration, where the spline was rolling in the differential. Then you look here and you see how long these splines are. The reason for that is these are designed to be cut down. So they're kind of a universal application, and they're designed for you to fit to your housing and to cut down without trying to order the exact custom length axle. So there's a couple ways to do this. The measurements are all from the front face of the axle flange to the end of the axle, and that's not a diagonal measurement. So you're not measuring from here in a straight line to here. You're basically, if you can imagine a straight line out, go 90 degrees down, that measurement there is the what the manufacturer considers the axle length. So what you could do is you could measure this. You could put a piece of plate steel or something on this, measure from the bottom side of the flange to the top, and then mark that on here and cut it. If I was using the same differential, I would do that, but because this is a new limited slip differential compared to the open differential, our measurements may be slightly different. They may not be, but what I want to do is I'm going to slide these axles into the housing, put them all the way in tight, up against the center pin in the differential, and then I'm going to measure from the face of the flange to the front edge of the bearing. Okay, so for once I happen to read the instructions, the installation instructions, and they say on the limited slip differential to do the driver's side axle first. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to slide this axle in. Alright, so I've got the axle shaft in. I'm going to slide the seal back off the bearing. So I'm going to put my straight edge on the bearing face. I'm going to measure off the flange. And that amount is the amount I can transcribe outside line to outside line here onto the axle, and that's the amount that I need to take off. So without even having to know a number, we can just use calipers to figure out what that length is that needs to come off. So let me grab a tape real quick. I know, because my old axles are 32 and these are 33, that this should be about a 1-inch gap that needs to come off. And it is, yeah, it's it's at 15/16, so we're right there, right where we need to be. Alright, so then the next step here, I'm going to slide this axle out. I got my caliper locked in on the length that I need to cut off here, so I'm going to just bring that up to the top of the axle. And you know what, before I do this, these things have oil all over them to keep them from flash rusting. So I'm going to clean that off real quick, off the ends of the flanges, or the splines rather. So I'm going to repeat this process for both sides. We'll get these marked, and after I have them marked, I'm going to set them aside for the moment, and then we'll clean this housing and third member up, and we'll get it ready for paint. We'll start painting this. That way we can be letting that dry while we're cutting the axles down. So, okay. I've just got this marked on the end, and I'm going to mark my end line here. And I know I'm actually going to keep that line marked in a couple spots here. Does not have to be precise. You obviously don't, like I said, you don't want this thing tight in there, but you have an inch of engagement. So if you're off by a 1/16 of an inch, you're going to be just fine. Okay, I've just got mineral spirits and some rags here. We're just going to get the rags covered with some mineral spirits here, and we're going to wipe this whole thing down, let it dry out, and then we're going to prime it. I'm not looking for a professional paint job. I just want the paint to stick, at least for a couple miles. Maybe we'll go so fast we'll blow the paint right off it. That'd be sweet. I don't think so. I know all the rage these days is I've been watching, this is Sick Week right now. I've been watching all the Sick Week YouTube videos and seeing all the turbocharged, supercharged, 1,000 horsepower cars. It's awesome, don't get me wrong. But it seems like the attitude these days, if you don't have 1,000 horsepower, you don't have anything. And boy, you know, 1,000 horsepower, it's not very streetable. Sure, a lot of guys drive them on the street. I kind of subscribe by that principle of I'd rather drive a slow car fast than a fast car slow. Maybe that's just because I can only afford slow cars. But I think this truck is going to be big and heavy. Going to be making about 500 crank horsepower. It's not going to be crazy fast. But you know what? 500 horsepower is nothing to bat an eye at. And once we get this truck done, you know, we play around with it, see how we like it. We can always go back and start to mod things. I just don't know if I'll ever be one of those 1,000 horsepower guys, you know? Looks like a lot of fun, but I don't know if it's for me. It's a lot of money. Seems like a lot of things go wrong. And then you got to pay a lot of money to fix them. There's something to be said for good, reliable horsepower. And I'm hoping that's what we end up with. Alright, I'll shut up for a while. I'll get this cleaned up. And then we'll hit this thing with the coat of primer. I'm sorry about the noise. You're going to have to work with me. I got to run the big torpedo heater just to keep the shop here warm enough for paint to dry. So, for these axles, we're going to cut them in the chop saw. This is how, I think I saw Speedway, Curry, a couple other people, this is how they're doing it. So, this is how we're going to do it. I've got the axle in the vise here. I'm going to get it marked up, and I'm way short there. And I'm glad I did measure these because one of the axle lengths is slightly different with the new carrier. The passenger side axle is just a hair shorter actually. Okay, got that lined up. And we're going to just take this nice and slow. I don't want to just ram this thing through and have the blade deflect off. So we're going to take it slow. We're going to let the blade do its thing. We're going to cut through this. Alright, that's one axle. Let's get the other one cut, and then I'll show you what we're going to do about the splines. Alright, we put a little bit of heat in these axles, which I'm not thrilled about. They say you want to try and avoid putting too much heat into them, but I had this first shaft, I don't know if I got just stuck in a hard spot on the shaft or what. I had to rotate it to actually get through it, but we got through it. It was no big deal. You'll notice you got burrs here on the ends of the splines now. And also now you've got a flush cut and the end's not chamfered. So it could be a little bit more difficult to get this axle into the rear differential. We're just going to take a flap disc in the grinder and put a little chamfer in this, and then we're going to come back with a file and clean up all of the splines in the axle. A horizontal bandsaw would really be the way to go for these, for cutting these, but I don't have one. So chop saw it was, and it worked just fine. Okay, and that's it. This axle's not ready to go in the rear end. So we're gonna get the other one done up here, and we're gonna get some paint on the housing, and then we're gonna slide these in. We're done with the rear differential. Okay, so the way that I like to do this is I like to slide the studs into corresponding holes, and then we'll measure. So we kind of know, since we know there's 3 patterns, we kind of already know that the outwardmost holes are going to be our 5 by 5, but also a lot of people, there's confusion on how to measure your wheel studs. It's not center to center. It's not outside to outside. It's outside of one stud to the center of one that's directly across from it. So you're not going right next to, you're going across the axle. So for this one, you can see that's, obviously these aren't pressed in, but when we get them semi-straight here, you can see that's a 5 by 5 there. So we're going to rotate one in. One side in all the way around. It's coming. Okay, and then we're just going to confirm. There should be 2 slots open between each stud. Kind of center this up. And that is 5 by 4.75. So that's what we're looking for. Outside of one stud to center of one across, 5 by 4.75. All right, so now what we're going to do is I've got this axle set up over here to be pressed. The part that kind of stinks about this setup is I've got my press set up as high as it will go. My axle is 32 inches long, and basically from the top of my plates here down to the center cross member is just under 32 inches. So I really don't have enough room in this press to do what I'm doing, but we're going to try and make it work here. So it's going to be a little more convoluted than it needs to be, but the way I have this set up, I've got my stud. I've got one stud already in the hole. I marked the right holes all the way around so I don't get confused and press the stud into the wrong hole. I've got one stud in with the back against the plate here, sticking up through the axle, and I've got a impact socket over the top of that stud so that I can put pressure down on the axle and seat that stud in place. So let's go ahead and press this one in. Just want to make sure we're going in even, and this should go pretty smoothly. Shouldn't be a bunch of resistance on it. And I'm just keeping an eye down on my bottom cross brace too, because I might have just enough room. Yeah, it is going to be just enough. Perfect. Awesome. Alright, so get this pushed down in nice and tight, and then we'll let this up. And the other thing you'll see here is I made sure I had a socket that had enough headspace where you can't see the top of the stud sticking up through this axle, because I didn't want to actually be pushing against the back and the top and kind of compressing the wheel stud. So at no point does this come in contact with the top of the stud. So just, if you're doing this, make sure you account for that as well. So there's our first stud in. We'll go ahead and get the rest of the studs in on both of these axles. All right, got them all pressed in. The one thing I didn't note before, the one thing you want to watch out for, because I see I caught it on one or two studs here, when you're using something like this to press and there's just enough room for it to fit into the shank of the socket, just you want to make sure you have that socket very centered. I didn't have enough room for a deep well socket, otherwise I would have put a deep well in there. Otherwise, if you're not quite centered, you can catch the edge of the threads on the shank. I've got just one stud here that's got kind of a flat spot on a couple threads. It'll be fine as soon as I run a lug nut on there. But just something you want to watch out for, because I didn't catch that until after the fact. So now that these studs are in there, we can go ahead and remeasure. And you'll see 5 by 4.75, 5 by 4.75. Do a rotation here. 5 by 4.75, 5 by 4.75. So everything looks good there. Now that we've got the studs on, as soon as the housing is dry, we'll slide the axles in. They won't be permanently installed yet because we don't have that brake kit for the disc brakes on the back, so we're missing the backing plate for that. But for now, we'll get the bearings put into the housing. Sorry, we'll get the axles put into the housing. We'll loosely mount them in. That way, when we get to the point of doing the suspension, we can use a rear end to mock up the rear suspension, and then we can use this as a rolling chassis. It's not going to be under any power until we have the rear brakes in, so it can all be kind of loosely mounted. So let's do that next. We'll get the axles put into the housing here, and then we'll be done with the rear end. All right, I've got our axle. It's just going to slide in. Okay. There we go. All right, yeah, this slid right in. Okay. Okay, so if you look in here, you can see this is the edge of the seal right here, right on the very end. I don't have it shoved all the way in yet. And you can see this black line on the seal. Essentially, this bearing only has enough room. Let's slide it in here. There we go. Slid in. You can see it slid just beyond that black line on the housing. Sorry, on the bearing seal there. You might look at that and say, well, we still got a quarter of an inch to go, but that quarter of an inch is going to be taken up by the brake backing plate. And then the retaining plate is going to sit on top of that. And the seal should be just a little bit proud of that backing plate. I'm going to grab the backing plates now. So I'll step over here. Grab the bolts and the backing plates here. Okay, so this is our retainer. It's going to slide around the axle, and you'll see as I hold that in, you can see the gap there, right? That gap will mostly be taken up by the brake backing plate. So nothing to worry about at the moment. for now, we're just going to loosely bolt these in. We're not going to tighten. We're not going to crank this down and crunch the seal real bad or anything. I'm going to wait to fill this until a little bit later down the line. So with gear oil, we will tag this thing that's with a note that says that we don't have gear oil in it, just so that we're safe. Because if it's not 3 months until I get the new brakes and tires and all that stuff put on, I want to be sure and not rely on my memory that I get gear oil put in this thing. So the next thing I'm going to do here, I'm just going to slide the axles in. We're going to loosely bolt these up with those T-bolts. I actually have to get new T-bolts as well. The set that I got are not the right size. They're loose in the housing, so I will upgrade those down the line as well, but for now they're going to work just fine. So let's get those T-bolts in, we'll get the other axle in, and that's going to finish up this rear end for now. Alright, here it is, finished product. What a difference, huh? Looks good. We just need, we need to replace the T-bolts, we need our brake kit, and that's pretty much it for this thing. Fill it up. I know we're going to have to do a little bit of modification on the spring purchase with the QA1 kit, but I wanted to get this thing mostly, you know, I don't mind coming in here, cutting, grinding a little bit, and then touching it up. I want to get this thing mostly ready to go so that we're sitting around waiting on parts and whatnot. So, yeah, it turned out nice. I mean, ended up going a little farther than we wanted to with the new axles, but that's okay. We got new axles, new wheel studs, new differential, ring gear, pinion, all new. New axle bearings, everything new. The only thing that we kept that was old was the housing, and that cleaned up pretty nice. So I'm very happy with that. Yeah, so that's pretty much going to do it for this episode. I just want to say thank you all for watching. Thanks for subscribing and liking the videos. If you're not subscribed, think about it. You know, check out some of the other videos. Subscribe if you like what you see. Love to have you as a regular watcher. Yeah. Next time you see me, we're going to be working on the frame, which you see in the background here. We got it back from Sandblasters and from the Sandblaster, and we're going to start looking at what we need to do repair-wise to the frame. There's a decent amount of work there. It's going to take us a little bit of time, but that's okay. So on the next episode, we're going to evaluate the frame. We're going to start doing some of the cardboard cutouts for the patches. We're going to do a little CAD work, cardboard aided design, and make up all the patches for where the repairs are going to happen on the frame. We'll lay all that out so you guys can see exactly how much work is going to go into this frame. And then we'll start cutting into it and doing the repairs in preparation for the QA1 kit, which may or may not have arrived this week. So things are moving. We're moving quick here. I'm really excited to get this thing back to a rolling chassis. It's going to feel like a real project at that point. I mean, not that it doesn't now. I mean, look at the shop. We got stuff everywhere at the moment. But, you know, it'll start feeling like we're making real progress once we start seeing some paint and some shiny things in the garage. And I'm very excited for that. So, yeah, as always, guys, your projects aren't going to build themselves. Get out in the garage, keep building, and I'll see you next week.